Yes, sir, we can hear you 10 on 10. That's good. So now we can start. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining me today and tonight. It's 8:37 right now p.m. So thank you so much for joining me. This is our first lecture in TFL. This is part of a lecture series that will be given on my YouTube channel. So stay tuned to be informed about when the next lectures are gonna be, inshallah. So there are gonna be many other lectures, of course. Our first lecture is entitled An Overview of Language Teaching Methods and Approaches. This is some kind of an introduction to the field of TFL for those, of course, who are new to this field. And for those who are not new to this field, those who have had a master's in TFL, of course, for 2 years, or those who had a module in the third year. Most of you had a module in the third year in the licence. So it was a very brief introduction to TFL in the third year. For those who had a very brief introduction to that, this is going to consolidate their knowledge about TFL and didactics, that we call in Algeria didactics. So as I said, this is some kind of an introduction to the field of TFL, which is, of course, teaching English as a foreign language, in Algeria called TFL didactics, but it is also called sometimes TSL, which is teaching English as a second language. In our second lecture, of course, we are going to explain what is the difference between TSL and TFL, because there is a slight difference there, which is worth discussing and talking about. But we'll come back to this difference, of course, as I said, in another lecture. For now, we'll just call it TFL, or if you want, you can call it didactics as well. So most of you, of course, are interested in this live video because you are going to pass the PhD, the doctorate entrance examination. So let me go to my slide. So this is going to be an overview, a general overview of language teaching methods and approaches. And I'd like to start, of course, with citing my source, which much of what I'm going to talk about today is available in the chapter in a book called Teaching English as a Second or Foreign Language, the second edition. Now they are at the fourth edition, so you can pause and note the title of the book or read it later on. I've included this particular book in my selection of 8 essential books in TFL, and you can find the link to that video in the description of this live stream. And this was a previous video, of course, that I posted I think last week or 10 days ago, in which I talk about my selection of 8 essential reads to get a knowledge or get an idea or consolidate your knowledge about TFL. So the key questions that we are asking today, and which are going to guide our discussion today. So the key questions, there are 3 of them. So our discussion today revolves around these 3 questions, and these are what are the methods and approaches that teachers have used over the years to teach foreign or second languages. And so we are going to go through, of course, in this particular part, we are going to go through the history of TFL or TESOL. And then the second question is what are the current methodological trends and challenges? And of course, the third one is about the future. Where does language teaching methodology appear to be heading? So these are the 3 key questions that are going to guide our discussion tonight. Now, I would like to start with this experience, which I'll come back to, of course, at the end of our live or our lecture together. And this experience, let me read that for you. So a committee of professors reviewing applications for the PhD graduate program in TESOL, what you are going to do. In TESOL come upon the statement of another applicant who declares in his statement of purpose that he wishes to be admitted to discover, or more ambitiously, to develop the one best method for teaching English as a foreign or second language. Now, several committee members utter words of impatience and disappointment upon reading his statement of purpose and his declaration that he is going to discover the one best method. They all say, oh no, not another one. They all say, here we go again. And so the reasons for the committee's reactions, these reactions of impatience and disappointment, the reasons for the committee's reactions to this statement of purpose will become clear in the course of this lecture. So I wanted to start with this experience, and I'm going to come back to it, of course, at the very end. Why did they react so negatively to what this applicant has said in his statement of purpose when he said, I'm going to discover the one best method? So keep that idea in mind and this experience in mind, because this is what our of course our lecture today is all about, and this is the experience which is going to put together the different parts of our lecture, and of course which is going to inform our conclusion at the very end. So just keep it in mind. Now, I'd like to start with this question of what is a method or an approach to language teaching. So linguists have made a distinction between the terms approach, method, and technique. Of course, approach, method, and technique as they apply to language teaching. An approach, now, first of all, an approach reflects a theoretical model. It provides a broad philosophical perspective, so we find it at the top. It provides a broad philosophical perspective on language teaching, such as found in the justification for the direct method, the reading approach, or the communicative approach. And we are going to discuss them all, of course, in this lecture, inshallah. Now, after a method, we have after an approach, we have a method. Under an approach comes a method. A method, on the other hand, is a set of procedures. It spells out rather precisely a step-by-step manner how to teach a second or foreign language. Now, examples of that can be found in methods such as the silent way, the community language learning, or Suggestopedia, all of which we are going to see, of course, together at one point in our lecture. So a method is, of course, more specific than an approach, but less specific than a technique. And then a technique in all of these were, of course, delineated or distinguished by Edward Anthony in 1963. So a technique, according to Anthony's diagram or system, is a specific classroom activity. It thus represents the most specific and concrete of the three concepts that we talked about, that is the approach, the method, and the technique. It's the most specific one. So some techniques are widely used and found in many methods. For example, we can talk about dictation, we can talk about listen and repeat drills, read the passage and fill in the blanks. All of these are methods. And so the other techniques, however, are specific or characteristic of one particular method. So you go one step back, and then the method is part of an approach. So I wanted to make this distinction between approach, method, and technique, because this is going to be very important for us, of course, in our subsequent lectures, and especially in today's lecture, and we'll come back to all of these. Now, yeah, if you want to ask questions, just leave your questions at the very end and I'll come back to them. All right, so just leave your questions, by the way, to the very end and I'll come back to them. You can ask me questions when we finish the lecture. So let's move on. Now I want to show you this image, which is the image of a pendulum swing. Now, so do you know what this is? This is what we call a pendulum swing. And it is used for many different purposes, for example, measuring time. Sometimes we see it in science education because you want to show gravity. Sometimes you see it on a desk as a decoration. So today we are using it for a different purpose, for a very specific purpose to our lecture. And the purpose is that we are using it as a metaphor that would represent the history of TFL and ESL teaching. So we want to use it as a metaphor for the shifting nature of TFL history, as an image of one approach coming and then being replaced by another one. This shift is what characterizes the history of teaching foreign languages in general, and more specifically teaching English as a foreign language. So this shift, constant shift going back and forth, has characterized TFL history for 100 years, and this is what we are going to talk about today in this survey of the different approaches, of course. Now, the field of foreign language teaching has in fact undergone many ups and downs and shifts and changes over the years. Now, TFL as a field, as a discipline, is not like, for example, physics or chemistry, which generally speaking do not change until a big discovery is made by, for example, Einstein, for example. And no, language teaching is a field in which you will see new stars coming up quickly and then suddenly disappearing as quickly as they came up. Now, this is why I have chosen this image of the pendulum swing, to convey the idea of this constant and recurrent shifts and changes and ups and downs and comes and goes. And in fact, any newcomer to this field of TFL should be aware of the history of teaching languages in general, foreign languages. They should have a sense of history in order to be aware of the linguistic, psychological, and sociocultural foundations and of the many methodological options that are available to us. And we are going to see that there are many. And this is what you will see starting from next week, of course, in the online course as well. So this is why, of course, our first lecture is an overview of the approaches in TFL, which I hope will give you the foundational knowledge that you will need in order to understand our next lectures, or to ground yourself within, or to have an understanding of this field in general before you go to specific domains, of course, in the field of TFL. So this is the image that I wanted to start with, and this links directly to the experience that we have started with earlier. And so now I want to go into the history of TFL, and we will start with pre-20th century trends and have a survey of key approaches, of course. Now we start, of course, with the grammar translation approach. Then we go to the direct method, then to the reform movement. Now, for the pre-20th century trends, now we are going to look together at a survey of key approaches, but before the 20th century, language teaching methodology was between two types of approaches. One focused on using the language, i.e. speaking and understanding, and the other one focused on analyzing the language, i.e. learning the grammatical rules. So again, the spectrum of teaching and learning foreign languages now was between these two extremes, using the language and understanding it, and knowing about the language. And so the history of TFL will, again, to come back to the pendulum swing that we have talked about earlier, the image, the metaphor of the pendulum swing. The history of TFL is between these two extremes, getting to use the language and analyzing the language, using the language and knowing about the language. And I guess that in your experience of learning English as a foreign language, you have seen how some of your teachers focused more on the use of the language, while others focused more on knowing about the language and the grammar and the forms. Some of your teachers focused on the meaning of the language and others on how to use the language. And so the shift between the two is what's going to characterize the history of TFL and TSL and foreign languages in general. Matter of fact, we are going to start with the Greek and Latin roots. And so, but in fact, the classical and medieval Latin periods were characterized by an emphasis on teaching people to use foreign languages. So they were more into the first trend. So the classical languages like first Greek and then Latin were used as lingua francas. And by lingua franca, of course, we mean the language of commerce and trade and of transaction, something that we'll come back to, of course, in our next lecture when we talk about key terms and concepts in TFL and TESOL. So higher learning, for example, was given only in these languages all over Europe, that is in Greek and Latin. So they were also used very widely, these two languages, in philosophy, in religion, in politics, and in business. Thus, the educated elite became like fluent speakers, readers, and writers of these appropriate classical languages. So we can assume that the teachers used informal and direct approaches to convey the form and meaning of the language they were teaching, and that they used oral techniques with no language textbooks, something that we'll come back to, of course, in the 20th century with the direct method, for example, with the communicative method, with the comprehensible method. All of these have roots in the Greek and Latin period. So then we move, of course, to the Renaissance and the printing press. And later on, during the Renaissance, the formal study of the grammars of Greek and Latin became very, very popular, of course, and that was thanks to, again, through the mass production made possible by the invention of the printing press. So in the case of Latin, it was discovered that the grammar of the classical texts was different from that of Latin being used as a lingua franca, which became known as the Latin of the common people. And so eventually major differences developed between the classical Latin described in the Renaissance grammars, which became the formal object of instruction in school, and the Latin being used for everyday purposes and in everyday life. Now, this occurred at the same time as Latin was being abandoned as a lingua franca. So yes, no one was speaking classical Latin anymore, and the various European vernaculars had begun to rise in respectability and popularity. So this led to the fact that people in one country or region began to find it find it very necessary and very useful to learn the language of another country or region. So thus the focus in language study shifted back to utility rather than analysis during the 17th century. So from there, we have one important figure, perhaps the most famous language teacher and methodologist of this period that we have just talked about, the Renaissance, is Comenius, who is a Czech scholar and teacher who published books at that time about his teaching techniques of foreign languages between 1631 and 1658. And so some of the techniques that Comenius used and espoused and defended were use imitation instead of rules to teach language. And so you can see here that we have a shift to using the language instead of knowing about the language, which of course, as we said, is important there, as a very different shift from knowing about the language and the grammar. And then what he also advocated was have students repeat after you, which is something that we still use in our classrooms today. And then we have use a limited vocabulary initially. All of these were things that you will find with many other, of course, methods in the 20th century and the 21st century as well. So you can see that the roots, and you will see this eventually, the roots of many different languages are in very ancient history and back, for example, in the 17th century. So the next one is to help students help your students practice reading and speaking, which is something, again, that focuses on the use of the language rather than knowing about the language. So these are some of the ideas and things that Comenius defended. Now, teach language through pictures to make it meaningful. And this is, again, a very important idea in many different approaches in the 20th century that we are going to talk about. So moving on, we start with then the grammar translation method, and we are going to explain now what is the grammar translation method. Now, Comenius's progressive views were very popular for a long time. However, by the beginning of the 19th century, the systematic study of the grammar of classical Latin and of classical texts had once again taken hold in schools and universities throughout Europe. And so the analytical grammar translation approach became firmly rooted as a way to teach not only Latin, but also by extension the vernaculars that had become modern languages as well. And so we have here a shift back again, the pendulum swing, which shift back again to a focus on not so much how to use the language, but how to analyze the language and knowing about the language. And that would be made possible and introduced again by the grammar translation method. So the grammar translation method is a method in which instruction is given in the native language of the students, so that if you are a native speaker of Arabic, it is Arabic which is used to teach you French or to teach you English, which is going to be very different, of course, from the ways in which the direct method would use would teach you the language, of course. Now, the second one is that there is very little use of the target language for communication, and this highlights the fact that now with the grammar translation approach, the focus is on knowing about the language and not so much about using the language. So the focus, in fact, then our next point, the focus, in fact, is on grammatical parsing, that is, the forms and inflections of words. And so there is, for that purpose, then, there is early reading of difficult texts, which is, again, going to be very different from the later approaches, which focused on given very limited, very accessible texts that focus on comprehension rather than learning difficult vocabulary. But that's not the case with the grammar translation approach. A typical exercise, of course, this is why it's called the grammar translation approach. A typical exercise is to translate, in fact, sentences from the target language into the mother tongue or vice versa. Also what we call back translation, that is to translate it from the target language into the mother tongue and then from the mother tongue into the target language. And so this is one fundamental characteristic and aspect of the grammar translation, important aspect in the grammar translation approach is the result of this approach is usually an ability on the part of the student to use the language for communication, something that I have talked a little bit about before. Because, of course, as we have said before, the focus here is not so much about using the language, it is about knowing about the language. And so this is one important aspect of the grammar translation approach. Then another aspect then is the teacher does not have to be able to speak the target language fluently. Now, I think that this is a very important aspect of the grammar translation approach, because it is very different from what we are going to see later on with other approaches, and with the next approach, or with the next method, which is the direct method, which emphasized and which defended and which exclusively uses the target language, that is English, and English in case you are teaching or learning English, of course. Now, so the direct method, the swinging of the pendulum then would continue. By the end of the 19th century, the direct method, which once more stressed as its goal the ability to use rather than analyze a language. And so here we have, we come back in the pendulum swing again to using the language rather than knowing about the language, which is going to be, as you can see already, as you realize, the fundamental characteristic, the trend that we have in this 100 years, the thread that holds together and that defines the emergence or the dismay of any particular method. So the direct method, by the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, started to become as some kind of an alternative to the grammar translation method, which was by that time very popular and which is still used, by the way, until now, and has many enthusiasts all over the world. And so a leading figure in the direct method is Francois Gwyn, who is a Frenchman who began to publish his work on the direct method in 1880, and so by the end of the 19th century. So what he advocated, contrary to the grammar translation method, he advocated the exclusive use of the target language in the classroom. So if you are teaching English, you can't use, for example, your native language, which is Arabic, with the students, and you can't allow them to use Arabic if they are learning English with you, which is a very different approach to teaching and learning foreign languages that we have seen, for example, with the grammar translation approach, which uses the native language, as we have seen, to teach a foreign language. So the direct method became very popular of course, in France and Germany. And even today, it has enthusiastic followers among language teachers in many countries. And so let's look at some aspects and characteristics and features of the direct method. Now, the most important one, which makes it totally different from the grammar translation method, the most important one is that you cannot, of course, use the mother tongue. It is not permitted to use the mother tongue. The teacher doesn't even need to know the student's native language. So he can be a native speaker of the language that you are learning. So if you are learning English, your teacher, it is preferable in the direct method. It is preferable that your teacher does not speak your native language, which is Arabic, and so he is going to be most probably a native speaker of English, is American or Australian or British, for example. So doesn't need to speak the native language that you are learning. So lessons begin with dialogues and anecdotes in modern conversational style. Why? Simply because the focus again is on using the language and not so much on knowing about the language. In fact, in the direct approach, in the direct method, you don't learn in a direct way about the language. You learn directly how to use the language, how to use the language in communication, which is a very different approach than what we have seen with the grammar translation approach, of course. Actions and pictures are used to make meaning clear, of course, because the focus here is on meaning rather than on the form. The focus here is on comprehension rather than about learning about the language. So grammar is learned, but it is learned inductively. Now, we'll make the difference, of course, in more details about what is the difference between inductive and deductive in the next lecture. So what we mean by that, just briefly, is that by repeated exposure to language use, not through rules about forms, which is the method, of course, of the grammar translation approach. Now, literary texts are read for pleasure. Literary texts are read for pleasure and not analyzed grammatically, which is the case, in fact, which is contrary to what the grammar translation approach would do. The target culture is also taught inductively, and so everything is indirect in terms of learning about the language, and everything is direct in terms of using the language for communication. So from the direct approach then became very popular, and by the end of the 19th century and beginning of 20th century, and as I said earlier, it has right now many followers, and there is a very popular method which is used all over the world called Berlitz. And Berlitz is a method. There is a school here in Algeria, an international school called Berlitz. Berlitz is based on the direct method. So the teacher then must be a native or have native-like proficiency in the language, which is again very different from the grammar translation approach. Now we move now to the reform movement. You might recognize the IPA. So in 1886, by the end of the 19th century, during the same period that the direct method first became popular in Europe, of course, the International Phonetic Association, also known as IPA, was established. And it was established by many scholars, amongst them, of course, Henry Sweet, and Paul Passy. All of these phoneticians established the IPA, or the International Phonetic Association. So they developed the International Phonetic Alphabet, which is also called IPA, and which of course you find now in your dictionaries. And this is a transcription system, of course, designed to represent the sounds of any language, of course, and it became part of what we call the reform movement in language teaching in the 1890s. And so these phoneticians who founded and established the International Phonetic Association, and subsequently, of course, established what became known as the International Phonetic Alphabet that you find in your dictionaries for this transcription. These phoneticians, of course, made some of the first truly scientific contributions to language teaching when they advocated the principles that we are going to talk about now. Now, these principles included the spoken language is primary and should be taught first. And so here we come back again to speaking the language. So the work of these influential phoneticians focused mainly on pronunciation, on the teaching and learning of pronunciation and of oral skills. This was really their focus. And you can see that again from all of these different aspects of the reform movements. Now, the findings of phonetics should be applied to language teaching. The language teachers must have solid training in phonetics, and learners should be given basic phonetic training to establish good speech habit. All of these became very important in the what we call the reform movement. And as you can see, again, as I said earlier, these phoneticians focused on the teaching of pronunciation and oral skills, which they felt had been ignored, of course, by the previous grammar translation approach. And thus, although the reform movement is not necessarily considered a complete pedagogical approach to language teaching, its promoters, that is these phoneticians, considered that you have to have a significant incorporation of the teaching of pronunciation, phonetics, and oral skills in the foreign language classroom, or more specifically in teaching English as a foreign or second language. Next in our list, we come now to early and mid 20th century. And here we come to the reading approach, the audiolingual approach, and the oral situational approach. And we are going to talk about these three. And then we move to the three last ones, which came by the mid 20th century. So we begin, of course, with the reading approach. In the early decades of the 20th century, the Modern Language Association of America supported the reading approach to language teaching. Now, what is the reading approach? The reading approach was popular in North America, that is in the United States and in Canada, until the late 1930s and early 1940s. The rationale behind this approach was that given the limited skills of most language teachers in America and in Canada at that time, all that one could reasonably expect was for students to come away from the study of a foreign language being able to read the target language, with emphasis on some of the great works of literature and philosophy that have been produced in that language. Now, this reminds you a little bit of the grammar translation approach, which of course focused on reading as well, but reading of difficult texts. But the reading approach introduced some new, very interesting techniques and very interesting procedures to the teaching and learning of a foreign language. Now, the first one that I want to talk about is the fact that the reading approach advocated only the grammar useful for reading is taught, and not other aspects of grammar. So if a grammar element is not considered useful for the reading, it is not taught. But then again, grammar is taught, which means that we come back a little bit to in the pendulum swing that we talked about earlier, we come back to the focus on knowing about the language rather than using the language. But with a slight difference here that is going to become very evident in a few minutes. So vocabulary is controlled at first based on frequency and usefulness, and then expanded, which is different from the grammar translation approach, which, as we have seen earlier, right from the beginning, you are given a text, but you are given very difficult texts to read in Latin or in French or in Greek, and there is no limit to the kind of vocabulary that you are going to be exposed to in the grammar translation approach. Whereas in the reading approach, the vocabulary is very controlled at the beginning in terms of frequency, but also in terms of level. And so translation is once more a reasonable classroom procedure. So we have the grammar translation approach coming back. And so what you would usually see in the reading approach is that the teacher is going to read a text in, for example, in French and translate it to English, or vice versa, which of course it shows how the grammar translation approach remained very influential for a long time in teaching foreign languages. Reading comprehension is the only language skill emphasized, which means that there is no listening, which means that there is basically no writing, but more importantly, this means that there is no speaking. And so the oral dimension on the oral skill is ignored, or at least not emphasized, which again, in the pendulum swing that we talked about earlier, is a shift towards knowing about the language, knowing about the rules, knowing about the form, knowing about the structure, rather than using the language in production or in speaking. So the teacher does not need to have, consequently, because the only skill which is, of course, emphasized is the reading comprehension, then the teacher does not need to have a good oral proficiency in the target language, because all they do in the classroom is read the text and of course answer questions or fill in the gaps or whatever else. And so again, that focus on using the language is gone with the reading approach, and the first language is used to present reading material, discuss it, and check understand it. So if you are reading the text in English, most of the classroom discussion, most of the most of the understanding is done in Arabic. So, which is very, again, different from the ways in which, as we said, we have seen the grammar, the direct approach being used. We move now to the audiolingual approach. Now, the audiolingual approach in America was born when World War II broke out and made it necessary for the US military to quickly and efficiently teach members of the armed forces, the army. They wanted to teach them how to speak foreign languages and to understand them when they spoke to other native speakers in Germany, for example, or in France, or in any other place all over the world. And so where the US soldiers fought, they wanted them to be able to speak to natives there, whether we are talking about the army, native army, or the native population. So what the US government did at that time is that it hired linguists to help teach languages and develop materials, and that gave birth to the audiolingual approach, which is sometimes called, in fact, the army method. And so it drew on both the reform movement and the direct method, in fact, from both the reform movement that we talked about earlier, which emphasized phonetics, oral skills, development of oral proficiency, and pronunciation. Remember that. But also from the direct method, which emphasized using the language, of course, as we have seen. So it drew from both of the reform movement and the direct method, but added some features from structural linguistics and what we call behavioral psychology. So much of what the audiolingual approach advocates comes from what we call behaviorism. And behaviorism, as you might know, of course, was mainly as a psychology. The behaviorism was mostly developed by Skinner. So structural linguistics begins with describing, of course, minimal and small distinctive sounds and units, or phonemes, and all of this again comes to us from the study and the analysis of linguistics, which then would form lexical and grammatical elements, what we call, as you might know, morphemes, which then form higher structures. So we start with little things and then we go to higher structures such as phrases and clauses and then sentences. Now, in behavioral psychology, learning is based on getting learners to repeat behaviors. Now, these behaviors can be verbal and they can be non-verbal. So they have to, and this is why we call it behaviorism, they have to keep repeating them until they become fully learned as habits, which all of this was based on the ideas and concepts and let's say philosophy as well, and method and approach developed, of course, by psychologist Skinner, who is considered to be the father of behaviorism. Now, The audiolingual approach would begin lessons with dialogues, and then we use mimicry and memorization. Very important in behaviorism is to memorize and to repeat and to imitate, which is based, all of this is based on a simple idea, which is that language learning is habit formation. So whenever you want to think about behaviorism and you don't know how to define it, it's very simple. Just think of behaviorism as some kind of a habit formation method. That's all what behaviorism is about. Now, grammatical structures are sequenced and rules are taught inductively through planned exposure, of course. Now, the next thing, skills are sequenced. First, we have listening and then speaking, and then comes reading and writing, which are a bit postponed. And so here with the audiolingual approach, it's a bit different from the others because it tries to have some kind of a balance in terms of the skills. So it doesn't completely ignore any one particular skill, although of course we start with the listening and then the speaking at an early stage, but then the reading and writing are postponed in the lesson or in the stage of the learning process, of course. Now, accurate pronunciation is stressed from the beginning, which of course tells us that the audiolingual approach, it is an approach which stresses the fact that you have to be correct. And we are going to talk in subsequent lectures about the difference between accuracy and fluency, which is a very important difference and a very important dynamic in the classroom, and these two are very important concepts in TFL. And in fact, the pendulum swing going from accuracy to fluency, going back and forth, is what characterizes the history of TFL and what characterizes the different concepts that we have in this field. So accurate pronunciation is stressed from the beginning, which tells us a little bit that the audiolingual approach is also, it is about using the language, but it is also about knowing about the language, because you have to be correct, you have to be accurate. Vocabulary is severely controlled and limited in the initial stages, which is a very different idea from what we have in the grammar translation approach, for example, which, as we have seen, would emphasize or wouldn't find it problematic to give students very difficult texts to read right from the beginning. A great effort is made to prevent learner errors, which means that this approach is based on accuracy rather than on fluency. It's the extent to which you are correct, not the extent to which you speak or you talk or you communicate to get the message through, which is what we see in, of course, in the other one, which is fluency. Sorry. Now, next, language is often manipulated without regard to meaning or without regard to context. And so here, this is very important difference, for example, between the audiolingual approach and the other approach, which is the direct approach, for example, which we have seen, in which using the language is contextualized and you are put in a certain situation. This is going to be very different, for example, also from the communicative approach that we are going to talk about in a few minutes. So then, moving on, The teacher must be proficient only in the structures, vocabulary, and other aspects of the language, and he or she is teaching, since learning activities and materials are carefully controlled. Again, which means that the focus of the audiolingual approach is on accuracy and is on knowing about the language rather than using the language, which is something very different, for example, from the other approaches that we are going to talk about in a few minutes. So the audiolingual approach was in the United States. The oral situational approach was basically in Britain. And in Britain, we have the historical pressures that, and this is an image of John Firth. In Britain, the same historical pressures that prompted the development of the audiolingual approach gave rise, in fact, to the oral or situational approach. The same historical pressures, that is World War II, the need to teach soldiers, all of that. It rose as a reaction, of course, to the reading approach and its lack of emphasis on listening and speaking, because as we have seen, the reading approach was mostly about reading and not about the other skills. So this approach was very dominant in Britain during the late 1940s till the 50s and 60s. So it drew on the reform movement that we have seen before, and it drew also on the direct approach that we have seen before, but it added features of this man, John Firth, or what we call Firthian linguistics. And Firth, of course, much of his work was in the 1950s, and especially in 1957. And so the emerging field in linguistics, which became later on TFL or TESOL, or teaching foreign languages. Here, from the 1950s on, we would have the beginning of the development of what we now call the field of language pedagogy. It really started in Britain, and it really started with the oral situation approach. It really started with what we call a Firthian linguistics, and you can look him up. Very important linguist who made early important contributions to the field of language pedagogy, if you are into knowing some of the background of teaching foreign languages. Then, so the oral situational approach, the spoken language is primary. All language material is practiced orally before being presented in written form. So all of it would focus on the oral language, which comes really from the reform movement. Only the target language should be used in the classroom. So this comes to us directly from the direct approach, and so this is very different, for example, from the what we have seen with the grammar translation approach, in which there is no problem if you use for the grammar translation approach, there is no problem if you use the native language. Again, only the target language in the oral situational approach is allowed. Efforts are made to ensure that the most general and useful lexical items are presented, of course, and grammatical structures are graded from simple to complex, which again means that the oral situational approach is not an approach that ignored the teaching and learning of grammar. It did, but more or less inductively, in the same way that we have seen with the direct approach. Now, new items, that is when we are talking about lexical items or grammatical items, are introduced and practiced situationally, that is in context. And this is why it is called the oral situational approach. In fact, the oral situational approach advocated organizing structures around situations. Example, at the pharmacy, at the restaurant. These provided the learner with the maximum opportunity to practice the target language. However, now practice often consists of little more than pattern practice or choral repetition or reading of text and memorization of reading of dialogues. And so here we will see that this is then taken to another level with the communicative approach, which of course would drop all of these things like memorization, like reading, and emphasize the direct use of the language inside the classroom. Now, more recent approaches then, these begin with the 20th century, the cognitive approach and the affective humanistic approach and the comprehension-based approach, and last, the communicative approach. So the cognitive approach, to start with, is by two people that you probably know about. One is very famous. Many English language students know this man, Noam Chomsky, of course, and it comes to us from what we call Chomskyan linguistics, and Ulrich Neisser. So this approach was a reaction to the behaviorist features of the audiolingual approach. Now, it was this approach, the cognitive approach in foreign languages, it was influenced by the cognitive psychology, which was, of course, led by psychologist Neisser, and, of course, by what we call by now Chomskyan linguistics. Now, cognitive psychology by Neisser holds that people do not learn complex systems like language or mathematics through habit formation, like the audiolingual approach and behaviorism tells us, but rather through the acquisition of patterns and rules that they can then extend and apply to new circumstances or problems. So likewise, in Chomskyan linguistics, language acquisition is viewed as the learning of a system of extendable rules based on meaningful exposure. So with the approach being very simple, with hypothesis testing and then rule inferencing, and not like we have seen with the audiolingual approach. This is not done through habit formation and driving the learning process by habit formation or memorization. So features of the cognitive approach include language learning is viewed as rule acquisition rather than habit formation, which is again something very different from what we have seen with the audiolingual approach, which was, as we have seen, basically based on the habit formation and on behaviorism. Then instruction is often individualized. Learners are responsible for their own learning. This is going to be very different from other approaches. Grammar must be taught, but it can be taught deductively, rules first, practice later, or inductively, rules can either be stated after practice or left as implicit information for the learners to process their own. But we have here knowing about the language. We have a comeback of knowing about the language, of knowing the rules of the language, of accuracy to some extent, as something that must be achieved, although it is a bit different from the accuracy of the audiolingual approach, which was, as we have seen, based on the fact that you have to repeat until you learn the form or the language. Next, pronunciation is de-emphasized. Perfection is viewed as unrealistic and unattainable, which is again very different from the reform movement. First, because the reform movement based on phoneticians and IPA emphasized pronunciation and emphasized being correct when you pronounce something. And from the audiolingual approach, which of course was based on the reform movement and which, as we have seen, emphasized pronunciation. So reading and writing are once again as important as listening and speaking. Vocabulary learning is again stressed, especially at intermediate and advanced levels. So vocabulary learning, which we have seen became again very important in for example, the reading approach, would again be emphasized in the cognitive approach. Then we have errors are viewed as inevitable, to be used constructively for enhancing the learning process, for feedback and correction. Something that we are going to talk about in subsequent lectures is the difference between error and mistake. Now, this distinction that you probably know about. Now, errors are related to something that you don't know. Now, mistakes are slips. Now, errors are related to your competence. Mistakes are related to your performance. Now, we'll come back to this important distinction between the two, because making the difference between error and mistake can inform a lot of the different methods and approaches and procedures that you use in the classroom, as well as activities. The teacher is expected to have good general proficiency in the target language, as well as an ability to analyze the target language. So you can see here that we have a coming back of knowing about the language, of accuracy of the language, of knowing the grammar of the language. All of that is seen as important for the use of the language. So the acquisition of certain grammatical rules is seen as important in the cognitive approach. We move to the affective humanistic approach, which came, the pendulum swing goes back again. This approach developed as a reaction to the general lack of affective consideration in both the audiolingual approach, the army approach, and the cognitive approach. So the focus of this approach is on the social climate in the classroom and the development of positive relationships between the teachers and the learners, between the learners themselves, or the relationship between the different people inside the classroom is seen as the most important thing in the affective, and here we have the affective humanistic approach. So your feelings are given more importance than you being correct or incorrect, you knowing the grammar or not, you knowing the rule or not. And so you can see that we have a very important shift, and the affective humanistic approach came as a reaction, again, the pendulum swing came as a reaction to the cognitive approach that we have seen before, and it became very prominent in the 1970s, whereas the cognitive approach developed in the 1960s as a reaction to the audiolingual approach, of course. So the argument of the affective humanistic approach is very simple. The argument is that learning a language is a social and personal process, that this has to be taken into account when teaching. And so there are some of these are that we are going to talk about and show now. These are some of the fundamental principles and characteristics characteristics of this approach. First, respect for each individual, students and teachers, for their feelings is emphasized. So communication that is personally meaningful to the teacher is given to the learner, is given priority. And here we have the pendulum swing shifting again towards rather than knowing about the language into using the language, which again is something that we have seen is would characterize the whole history of TFL. So then instruction involves much work in pairs and small groups, something that we would see again with the communicative approach. The class atmosphere is viewed as more important than materials or methods. So creating a safe, sometimes fun atmosphere and environment is very important in this approach. Peer support and interaction are viewed as necessary for learning. Learning a second or foreign language is viewed as a self-realization process. So you can see here that the emphasis is on the individual and on the individual achieving their goals and their desires with respect to how they feel about the whole process of making that kind of achievement, of course. Then the teacher is a counselor and a facilitator rather than the ultimate source of knowledge. So we'll talk about this in subsequent lectures, of course. When we talk about teacher speaking time and student speaking time, the teacher speaking time here is very reduced in the affective humanistic approach. Rather, those who speak all the time and are active all the time are the learners. And so you can see here that we have an early development already of what we call student-centered approach versus teacher-centered approach. And this is something that we are going to talk about, of course, in subsequent lectures. So next, the teacher should be proficient in the target language and in the student's native language. Since translation may be used, not as much as in the grammar translation approach, but it can be used. Why? Because in the affective humanistic approach, what you want is to help students feel at ease, and later on it is gradually phased out. So this translation is used to make translation that is to the native speaker, the native language of the learner is used, that is in our case Arabic can be used to make the learners feel at ease and to lower their affective filter, a term that we are going to talk about in our subsequent lectures, of course. Then next is the comprehension-based approach. Now, this is led by famous Stephen Krashen. We are going to have a whole lecture devoted to Stephen Krashen and his comprehensible input hypothesis. The comprehension-based approach is, of course, an outgrowth of research in first language acquisition that led some language methodologists to assume that second language learning or foreign language learning is very similar to L1 learning, to learning your native language. And so we talk more, rather than learning, we talk about acquisition. And we are going, of course, to make the, we are going to talk about this acquisition and learning dynamic a lot in our next lectures. And so the idea, the simple idea of the comprehension-based approach is that learning a second language or foreign language is very similar to learning a first language and the acquisition of a first language, and that extended exposure and comprehension, i.e. listening and understanding, or reading and understanding, doing a lot of that must come before production. And so here we would have the primacy of listening and reading before speaking and writing, of course, as two skills. So crashing and the best known of the comprehension based approaches is crashing, and the natural approach by Tracy Terrell in 1983. Now the crashing worked a lot in the 1980s. So some of the characteristics of the comprehension based approach are: listening comprehension is very important and is viewed as the basic skill that will allow speaking, reading, and writing to develop spontaneously over time, given the right conditions, of course. And so we are going to talk a lot about these right conditions when in our subsequent lectures. Then learners should begin with the silent period by listening to meaningful speech and by responding non-verbally in meaningful ways before they produce language themselves. Learners should not speak until they feel ready to do so, which is a bit different from the communicative approach, as we'll see. Such delayed oral production results in better pronunciation than if the learner is expected to speak immediately. And learners progress by being exposed to meaningful input that is just one step beyond their level of proficiency. Now, rule learning may help learners monitor or become aware of what they do, but it will not aid their acquisition or spontaneous use of the language. We are going to talk about all of this in more details when we talk about the theory of second language acquisition by Krashen. I have a whole lecture devoted to Krashen, to his SLA theory. Error correction is seen as unnecessary and perhaps even counterproductive, which is a bit different from the audiolingual approach and the cognitive approach, which both of them tell you that you have to correct errors so that eventually you eliminate them because the focus is on accuracy. So what is important is that the learners can understand and make themselves understood. And so here we have a shift back from accuracy to fluency. A shift from knowing about the language to using the language. A shift from speaking correctly, expressing yourself correctly, to making yourself clear. That's the important thing in the comprehension-based approach. If the teacher is not a native speaker or near native, appropriate audiovisual materials must be available online and in the classroom or lab to provide the appropriate input for learners. We come to the communicative approach, which of course this approach is an outgrowth of the work of linguists Del Hymes and Michael Halliday and Firth, among others, of course, and all of whom view language as meaning-based system for communication. So it's very simple with the communicative approach. Language is used for communication, and so that's what you should teach. That's your goal in the classroom, is to make the learners communicate. So now, serving this communicative approach serves now as an umbrella term for a number of designs and procedures. The communicative approach now includes task-based language teaching, project work, content-based and immersion instruction. All of these different things are put under what we now call the communicative approach. Let me give you some aspects of the communicative approach. Now, some aspects of the communicative approach are, of course, that The goal of language teaching is the learner's ability to communicate in the target language. That's the purpose. It is assumed that the content of a language course will include semantic notions and social functions, and that they are important as linguistic structures. So the key word here is social functions. That is, we use language in a certain context. And so you might recognize the expression language in use, of course. In some cases, the content is academic or job related, and so here we have the development of the field of ESP, something that we'll come back to, which becomes the course focus with language learning, a simultaneous concern, of course. Now, students regularly work in groups or pairs, something that we have seen before, but which is used a lot in the communicative approach. Why? Simply because the goal of the teaching and the learning is communication, and the best way to have communication is, in fact, to work in pairs or in groups in order to negotiate meaning. Remember that according to Himes and Halliday, language is communication and communication is meaning, and you use language to communicate meaningful tasks, and so that's why you use language. So negotiate meaning in situation and in which one person has information that the other lack. We are going to see, of course, many different activities based on that. Now, the communicative approach also, in the communicative approach also, students often engage in role play or in dramatization to adjust to their use of the target language to different social contexts. And so here you can see that the pendulum swing shifts again from knowing about the language to using the language with the communicative approach. So context becomes very important. Classroom materials and activities often consist of authentic tasks and project presented and practiced using segment of pre-existing meaningful discourse, because the context again is very important, and not materials, of course. These are completely avoided. Materials that are primarily constructed for pedagogical purposes are avoided. So instead, we have the use of authentic materials, natural speech, not prefabricated materials. Skills are integrated. The 4 skills in the communicative approach are integrated. So in the same activity, you can have listening, speaking, writing, and reading in the same activity, what we call integrated skills, because the idea here is that you want to develop the communication by focusing on the 4 skills at the same time, which we call integrated skills. This is very important, of course, from other approaches that would put this first and then this second and this third and this, or some of them, like for example the reading approach, that totally ignored some skills like speaking and listening and focused only on reading. So a given activity might involve, as we said, reading, speaking, listening, and also writing, and this assuming that the learners are educated and of course literate. The teacher's role is primarily to facilitate communication and secondarily to correct errors. So the teacher should be able to use the target language fluently and appropriately. Why? Because language is communication, which is the most important thing, and language has a social function, so it has to be appropriate. This is the most important thing, which doesn't mean that you don't correct errors and you don't correct mistakes. All of that you do in the communicative approach, but you don't focus on that per se as you do with the other approaches, as we have seen with the audio-lingual approach or with the cognitive approach, in which error and mistakes correction become the primary concern of the of the teacher. So let us sum up very quickly and finish this. To sum up, we can see that certain features of several of the pre-20th century approaches arose in reaction to preconceived inadequacies in an earlier approach or approaches. And so here we come back to the pendulum swing that we have talked about before. And so the more recent approaches developed in the 20th century, of course, and expanded in the early 21st century also do this to some extent. They push each other. And so each one is based on a slightly different theory or view of how people learn and use second languages, and each has a central principle around which everything else revolves, as summarized in the following slide. So I want to show you the following slide in which I want to summarize everything. And so the cognitive approach would say, for example, that the cognitive approach would say, for example, that language learning is rule-governed and cognitive behavior, not habit formation, in opposition to what the audio-lingual approach said. Then the affective and humanistic approach would say that learning a foreign language is a process of self-realization and of relating to other people. Then the comprehension approach would say that language acquisition occurs if and only if the learner receives and comprehends sufficient meaningful input. And then the communicative approach would come along and say that the purpose of language and thus the goal of language teaching and learning is communication. So as you can see from this summary in the following slide, all of these approaches would push themselves, and we have the idea or the metaphor of the pendulum swing, of course, expressed, I think, very accurately here in the following slide. So I want to finish with talking about where we are now. And where we are now is what we call the post-method era. And so I want to go to a criticism of all of these approaches. So before I go to, I want to come back to the designer approaches later on, but I want to go to the criticism of these approaches. And the criticism of these methods that we have seen and approaches is that it started, the criticism of the approaches started really, and the methods really started in the 1970s. And this should be, it can be one of the questions that you are going to have in the doctorate examination. Perhaps what is a criticism of the approaches or of the methods. The complex, Stevens is one of the first and early pedagogues who criticized the methods that we have seen. And he says that the complex circumstances of teaching and learning languages with different kinds of pupils, teachers, aims and objectives, approaches, methods and materials, classroom techniques, and standards of achievement make it inconceivable that any single method could achieve optimum success in all circumstances. So the criticism here is very simple. The criticism here is that no single approach can achieve 100% success. For now, we believe that this is impossible. And so we come back to the experience. If you haven't seen the experience that we have, that I have stated at the very beginning, which is that TESOL applicant for a PhD program saying that he is going to discover the one and only best method to learn or teach a foreign language. And the professors were frustrated and were disappointed at such a statement, because now we believe that there is no one single approach that can achieve 100%. And so this would introduce, of course, our next lecture. And so another criticism is made by, this is a rather recent criticism made by Adamson, who says that in 2004, who also critiques language teaching methods and suggests that attention now be turned to the teacher and the learner. And so here we would have the development of what we call the teacher-centered approaches and the learner-centered approaches, something that we'll come back to, of course, in our subsequent lectures together, and the ways in which they can operate effectively in the educational context instead of offering generalized pre-packaged solutions in the shape of materials, in the shape of teaching materials and strategies. And this is, of course, one important criticism. So we come to the big question: why there is no best method? You could have this question in your PhD entrance examination. Why is there no single best method in teaching a foreign language or learning a foreign language? Now, the answer to that is different methods. All of the different methods, for example, that we have seen together, different methods are best for different teaching and learning circumstances. The way in which you learn and teach English in Algeria is very different in terms of circumstances from the way in which you teach and learn English in France. The way in which you learn English in Britain is going to be very different from the ways in which you learn and teach English in Spain or in Algeria. The way in which you teach English in Algeria is going to be different from one city to another. The way in which you teach French in Algeria is going to be different from, for example, in Algiers is going to be different from the way you teach it in Ouargla. And so that these different methods are best for different teaching language circumstances. The second thing why there is no best method: all methods have some truth or validity. There is no one method which is completely wrong, and we are going to see that in the fact that many of the aspects that we have seen and characteristics that we have seen together of the different methods are now still used by many teachers and learners all around the world. And I think that you have recognized some of the methods in the way in which you have been taught the English language, or if you are a teacher, in the way in which you are teaching the language right now in the classroom. At least one from each of these different methods. So there is no one method which is completely wrong, and so all of them have some kind of validity, beginning from or starting from the grammar translation approach till the communicative approach. Then the third one, the whole notion of what is a good or bad method is irrelevant. The whole notion that is here, the question should not be, is there a good or a bad method? The question should be, what are your circumstances? What is your context? Who are your learners? What materials do you have available to you? How can you, and as we'll see together in the conclusion, how can you take all of these different the good practices that we have in all of these different approaches and adapt them to your own context? That's what is important. So in fact, this is what Brown would tell us about these approaches and about methods. He would tell us that so-called design methods seem distinctive at the initial stage of learning, but soon come to look like any other learner-centered approach, and it has been proven impossible to empirically demonstrate the superiority of one method over the other. And so Brown concludes that the classroom teacher do best when they ground their pedagogy in well-established principles of language teaching and learning. That's what is important, and that's what's going to be our next lecture about. And so we live now then in a post method era. And so what is best to be applied now, you should apply well-established principles in the post method era. And our conclusion for all of this then would be that rather than adopt, the teacher should adapt. Adopt is with an O, is to take as it is, and adapt is with an A, which simply means to take something and modify it to your own context. And this is what is important, and this is the conclusion. And we come here, of course, full circle back to that idea that our applicant said that he is going to discover the one best method to teach and learn a foreign language. And by now, we know that this is not possible, and that what you should do rather is ground your teaching and learning, and especially your teaching, in well-established principles in what we now call the post-method era. We are living right now in the post-method era. Now, this is it for today, and what we want to do next time, inshallah, is to talk about this post-method era, about the principles that we have right now, and how to follow a principled approach to teaching foreign languages away from any specific approach or method. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to today also is my server on the application Discord. So I have created a server on the application Discord that you might know about, and I have put in the link of this video. I have put a link in the description where you can join the Discord server that I have created for you. This is where we can have study groups. This is where we are going from time to time to have discussions on audio, and this is where you can ask questions, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. Of course, you will find the link to the Discord server in the description of this live video. Discord is an app available on iOS, on iPhone, and on Android on the Play Store, and it is also available on Windows, and it is also available online directly on your Chrome browser. Let me show you that very quickly. Do I have it here? I think I have it here. I don't know. Let me see. Let me show it to you very quickly. If I, yeah. This is it. Yes. This is it. If you can see that. Yeah. Yes. This is it. This is my Discord server. Then here you will find the study group. Welcome. Tell us. This is the welcome channel. This is the didactic study group. This is for resources. You will find books here. I'll put all the time books and articles there. This is study group for literature. This is study group for civilization as well. You can all get there and discuss without me being there. You can do that if you meet new people there, or if you know each other, you can all go there and prepare the PhD program together. Let's Talk is this is where we can talk on audio. This is the channel MrBourahla here, where you can ask question, or from time to time I'll try to do that as soon as I can, perhaps during the vacations. This is where we can practice your English orally and have like some kind of a communicative approach to learning the language. So this is my Discord, of course, server. Please join. This is very useful for you. I am sure that you are going to enjoy this, and thank you very much. I appreciate really staying up late until it's already 10:20. So thank you very much for joining me for this live. We are going to have another live very soon, in which we are going to talk about well-established principles in the post-method era. Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate this, and good luck with preparing for the PhD entrance examination. If you have any questions, please put them in the Discord channel and server that you can join right now, because I wanted to have to finish with questions, this live video with questions, but I think it's a bit late. It's 10:20 already, and so thank you very much for staying up until now, and see you soon on the Discord channel. Thank you very much. Salam.